Well, hello everyone. I can't see you. I have no idea how you make comments, but hopefully somebody could school you through as you do. But please do ask questions by raising your hand or by typing in the box. You can see the little wavy thing at the bottom. Type in the box, and as we go along, I'll try and adapt and answer questions and do what I can to make sure it's as meaningful as possible to you. I'm Becky Malby. I'm a professor at London South Bank University. I've just been here a week, actually. This is my second week here. But I've worked with Liz and the team at NHSIQ for some time now on networks. And my sort of credentials around leading networks is that's what I've always done. So whilst I grew up in and took part in hierarchical management, in general management jobs and in clinical jobs over the years, even to the level of working at the Department of Health many years ago, my passion and love is networks and how they change systems and organizations and how energizing they are for people, but they're also quite complicated and complex to manage and lead. They have their own challenges and they require a certain level of nurturing. So it's a very different role managing or leading networks than it is managing in hierarchies. And I was going to share some of my stories and some of the experience of doing that with you today. So I hope that's relevant. So here we go. This is what's the difference really. And I find that probably the best example of the difficulties people have is talking to some of the Vanguard sites. And talking to a chief exec recently who was talking about trying to set up their accountable care organisation and how that's done round a boardroom table once a week for 2 hours with all the partners. And that was the amount of time they were prepared to give to it or could give to it. And of course, their papers were littered with issues of governance and less littered with issues of purpose. And actually, accountable care, organisational accountable care systems are collaborative networks. And it struck me how if you were going to set up your own business, the amount of time you'd be putting into setup and the amount of attention you'd be putting into design. And I looked at this and it just struck me about the old world biting back, that sometimes we don't know how to set up and run new organisations in more networked models. That are more in line with the way most organisations are trying to manage and lead into the future now. So there's some work to be done here in the NHS about stopping the old world biting back and really trying to live in and shape the future through a good understanding of networks. And I hope that's what we can do today. I hope you enjoy doing that with me today. So just to say about the modern world of organizations. So if you look at global corporations now, what they're trying to do is innovate and grow in a completely different way as the nature of the economy, as the nature of knowledge, as the nature of social communications changes. So that most corporates understand they do need specialist expertise, but the only way they can deliver in a complex world is through collaboration, through partnerships, through making bigger wholes out of partnerships and bringing in the assets of other companies and other expertise. And that's pretty much the shape of things to come. And we're beginning to see that in the NHS as we've moved from the sort of old, I suppose, competitive models of commissioning, provision, separate, distinct, transactional, to hopefully a newer world of more collaboration. But what's interesting about the corporate world is very, very clear about what it can deliver within its own organisational form and what it needs others for. And I would say, you know, the first hurdle in any networked approach is saying, what is it that we can't deliver on our own that we need other people for? And that's probably where you have to start. And so it's not that we're sort of interdependent and there we have to work together. It's what are we trying to do and what assets can we all bring and how do we do that collaboratively? And it's a slightly more positivist stance than perhaps we're desperate and we therefore have to. So the dilemma here, I guess, is what the NHS currently has been experiencing, currently experiences. And it's these things, it's experiencing increased complexity. It has this absolute desire for control, and I think that is steeped in an anxiety about what happens when you're out of control. And in the health and social care environment, what happens when you're out of control, your biggest fear is that people die. So you can see why there's this desire to create control, but it's very all-encompassing over areas that we really can't. And so this need for certainty seems to be very, very critical. And every time things go wrong, or every time you hear about centralization, it's usually in response to something that's uncertain or feels out of control. So our experience of leading is in these highly transactional cultures. That's what the NHS has always been good at, and that's absolutely fine. We have very tame problems like hip operations. But where you have more wicked problems, which is an increasingly elderly population, so you're doing hip ops not in people who are 70, but who are people who are 80 plus 90 with comorbidities. That's much, much more complex than it ever was 50 years ago. So what does the NHS need? So that's what its current experience is. What's the new world requiring of it? Well, we have to just be much, much more adaptive. That ever-changing context, particularly the context of financial scrutiny and decreases in the welfare state, the lack of funding for people in poverty, the widening inequalities between rich and poor. Those require a significantly different adaptive capability. And if you look on your left-hand side in terms of what the NHS experience, that feels quite different from what it needs. It needs much more creative solutions. You hear people striving for different models and then finding the old world biting back wanting and having to do stuff in the old way and can't quite reconcile it. It needs new capacity and resources, and I think that's primarily not going to come from the third sector actually, but it is going to come from citizens themselves, people managing their own care or supporting enabling communities to do more work. So for instance, there's a GP practice in Leeds at Pudsey. They've managed to increase their list size by 450 people without any additional professional resource because the community is beginning to do things for itself and for each other. But it's an oversimplistic model, but it's well worth having a look at. It's on the Altogether Better website. It needs much more experimentation because nobody really knows what to do. So you somehow have got to lead through a relational culture rather than a transactional culture. And relational cultures mean you have to address issues of power, issues of disagreement, issues of different points of view, and you've got to do that across very diverse perspectives. And that's what networks do fabulously, and it's what hierarchies do very poorly. So I think we know there are three forms of organising in the world: hierarchies, markets, and networks. So in hierarchical organisations, the ones we're most familiar with, command is the basic instrument of control. So I tell you do. In markets, the transactions between producers and consumers are governed through price. Their markets are regulated by a consumerist model. And in networks, coordination is achieved through absolute open information, lots of informal contact between people, high levels of negotiation, adjustment, and real clarity of purpose. It's a high trust, social, community, clan type model. And in some ways, it's quite akin to what professionals are very experienced in. So maybe if we could draw some of our professional experience into managing more widely in the NHS, that would be helpful. So this is what you're used to, these company organizational charts. This is what most organizations look like, and yeah, if you've got any good idea, right down on the bottom, you're a manager in that bottom left-hand box. If you wanted to do something, you have to travel all the way up to the VP sales, and then to the executive team, and it might come all the way down, or it might come down another line, back up again. So our organizational charts are not dynamic, they're structurally very linear, they don't enable collaborations, collective learning, and cross-fertilization of ideas. So they are a very simple model, and somehow that's how we tend to describe organizations. If you go into organizational websites, you'll see they have this model of ups and downs, which is about trying to give people some sense, of course, that someone's in charge and someone's responsible. So if we look at what hierarchies do well, you might want to just type in the box if you've got any ideas. What do you think hierarchies do well? What do you reckon? Anyone typing away there? I'll give you some ideas once you put some in the box. So hierarchies are predictable, but they're not adaptive. So what hierarchies do is they can create some level of certainty around very linear problems. So if you absolutely know that if you do X, Y will always happen, hierarchies are perfect. if the world is describable, if the problems are tame, if you want to get things done effectively, where there's a really clear objective and a completely uncontested route to getting there, then hierarchies are perfect. So in anything that's uncontested, where it's completely known, payroll is a good example, then hierarchies are really efficient and effective. So you really are always thinking about linear and deterministic problems. Now, I don't think there are huge amounts of linear deterministic problems in health and social care. I think there's lots more complex problems, but somehow we apply this, and project management you see these new governing bodies being set up in systems, transformational change boards. They still tend to use this quite programmatic, problematic, problematizing, oversimplification, linear model of change, and that isn't what most of those folks are there to do. So they're useful when the goal is clear, the course of action to reach that goal is uncontested, there's no need for negotiation, you have the authority and the span of control to realise that goal, and it works where the world is predictable. They're not inherently adaptive. So this is network. This is how things often work in any organisational system, that all the reds are supposed to be in a hierarchy, but they all have to go and work with the blues and the yellows and the greens at any one time to get anything done. And we often talk about that as working the system. So this is the way the hierarchy is, this is how we work the system. So if you go to a more formal model of networks, that's how informal things tend to work. If you go to more formal model of networks, you often see things like this, sort of hub and spoke model. So there's a group top left who have got a very particular expertise in cancer care, and there's a group bottom right who've got a particular expertise around pain management, and there's a coalition that brings those together in service to patients and citizens. So what you see in networks is still some level of structure. It's not completely free of structure, but that structure is a peer-based model of organising around communities of interest, around shared expertise, and the word guiding coalition is very purposeful. It's not about the telling and selling. It's about the providing guiding principles under which autonomous practitioners and people can act. So what do networks do well? Well, networks are really fabulous where you've got complex problems where you need to be finding creative and adaptive solutions. So networks are high-performing around improvement and innovation. So they're really good where it isn't entirely clear what to do, or someone had a really good idea about how to do this somewhere else and you're trying to translate it into your own practice. So networks, the benefits of networks are that you can share risk, going back to our previous model, this one, that if the red hubs were different organisations, then rather than carrying the risk on their own, they can carry that risk collaboratively. So they're good at sharing risk, they're good at positive deviance, they're good at innovation, they're good at flexibility, and they're good at being responsive. So networks, whilst they take a lot to maintain, they can be very, very agile, very responsive, which is absolutely fabulous when you're in a personalised service system, where you're in service to people's personal needs and you're trying to bespoke and personalise care. They're really great at that. So they're good at developing inter-organisational working and improving health and social care. They have a different function, though. The function of networks is around generating creative solutions. It's about rapid learning and development, and it's about amplifying the effectiveness of individual members. So you join a network because your work will be better because of the relationships you have through the network. You can't do it on your own, you can do it much better together. So you generate a wider body of concern and support for your issue or for the thing that you want to do well. But mostly on the whole, networks generate better possibilities and better options for solutions. They broaden out the possibilities for solutions. I think this is one of my favourite slides, and certainly Liz and Georgie will know this well. But Brent James, who's been a great mentor of mine over the last 2 years, has this quite old and I think possibly a bit tired slide, but perfect for the type of dilemma we have in the NHS at the moment, which is the blue boxes are all about performance management and control. So there are monitor, TDA, regulatory, CQC. Now in high-performing systems, those regulatory, mandatory measures of performance management and control are minimal compared to the orange-pink box, circles and boxes on the right-hand side of your slide, which are all about innovation. The pink, orange, depending on your colours on your slide, are really a much more professionalised model. So on those slides, we're talking about spending time using data to generate an understanding and an inquiry that you do together through a peer network in service to service users and carers. And you do that through delivery teams or through learning teams. But in high-performing systems, you see 80% of the organizational effort on that orange-pink side, and up to, certainly not over 20% of the time on the blue. And we somehow have it flipped the other way around. In our fear of things going wrong, letting things out of control, our lack of trust of frontline staff, I think probably for me very well demonstrated by how the junior doctors have responded to the contract, that the relationships between the tops and the bottoms, between policy and frontline, doesn't feel like one of trust. And you have to have a very strong trusting culture. Trust, i.e. relational culture, where you really understand everybody's experience of health and social care. You have data-driven decisions, and you have really good peer review and accountability. Now, when you have that in place, you can run as a network a more innovative organisation. Where you don't have that in place, then you're going to rely on performance management for control. And particularly in the NHS and local government at the moment, we are very data poor at the front point of decision making with service users and citizens about their care. And until we can strengthen that, we're going to struggle. But it doesn't mean that you can't develop professionalised learning models that straddle this and begin to shape the future of the NHS so that we can pull away from that very dominant performance management culture, which in effect slows down and inhibits change and turns our relational issues into transactional issues. Okay, so I'll give you two scenarios, and you can see here which one is better amenable to performance management and which one to a more professionalised system. So if you have 30% chest pain outpatients at Leeds Teaching Hospital Trust have no clinical symptoms of heart conditions, is that something that you need performance management for? Is that something where you need really good professional peer review? I would say you absolutely need really good professional peer review. What is going on that means that those folks are ending up in that place? And there's a level of clinical decision making all the way through to that point that's meant that that's where they've ended up. It's very rarely that that's a management issue. It's much more a clinical issue. If you look at fracture neck and femur example here, if we know that it's entirely predictable how many people with fracture neck and femur come to A&E, and it is predictable. Older folks tend to fall over when they've got out of bed in the morning for a wee, and they fall over again when they've got up from their nap. So they tend to fall over sort of 8 or 9 in the morning and about 3 in the afternoon, which means they end up in A&E at about 10 and about 4. And you can see in A&Es that there are those sorts of spikes, and it's entirely predictable across a whole week, the range, the numbers that are likely to turn up. Now, getting those people and scheduling them into theatres, given that you know that is a management issue, that's a performance management issue, that isn't the same thing. So give you some sense of just slight difference in the sorts of decision making and the sorts of requirements you're going to need. So in order to manage that fracture neck and femur issue, you need good performance management systems. It's a hierarchical response. To manage the TBD issue, you absolutely have to have a network where you can inquire together about how can we improve this patient's journey, this patient's experience. So when I talk to chief execs, they often say you need both. It's not that you have to do hierarchy or networks, you have to be able to do both. For any effective organisation and deploying your resources and decision-making processes, you've got to say, what's the work of our organisation? What do we have to do through hierarchies and what through networks? And I think this is the crux of it, that many senior leaders are very experienced in hierarchies and really struggle to then flip their behaviour into leading in a network. So as you can see, as I was explaining earlier on, that this is how corporates are going. You know, their corporate organisations are beginning to now network with their preferred supplier. They're developing joint ventures, strategic alliances. They might have licensing partners. They might have global affiliates. They might have outsourcing partners. That's the corporate world, and in some ways we're in a similar sort of domain. that interdependence now has to be worked at collectively rather than contractually or transactionally. And that's a big shift, and that's something that isn't just happening in the NHS at the moment. Okay, so you need both. You need for the day-to-day business, you need hierarchies, and for this agile and adaptive system, you need to have networks. And making both of these work is really critical for healthcare systems. So this is how hierarchies are organised, this is how networks are organised. So both of them have real clear purpose. But what you have in networks is a set of guiding principles about how you might realise that purpose. This is sort of how we do business around here. Within hierarchies, you have clear output expectations, you have targets. In networks, you have a number of principles which might be about high learning, it might be about doing no harm, it might be about making the most of diverse views. You'll find some principles that are really common and say you have to account for how you're reaching that purpose using these shared principles that we've developed. And actually, and then as a peer-based group, you're accountable to each other around that. So your relationships with the network are always peer. They're always around reciprocity. That means exchange. That if I do something for you, you do something for me. Not in a time-banked way, just in a spirit of generosity. And that what you give and receive can be time, skills, resources, information. But everyone in a network has something to offer, and everybody is seen as an asset. Now, if you go over to hierarchies, it's much more of a need-to-know model. So it isn't that everybody can or needs to know or should know absolutely everything. It's in relation to this issue, what do I need to tell you in order for you to do the task that has been set for you? There's no sense of understanding the whole. In networks, you're always looking into the whole. You're always trying to understand the whole pathway, not just the bit. So what happens in networks in terms of how peers organise is through requests and offers. So people might say, I'm a bit stuck on this, can you help? Or I don't understand this, or I'm really interested in this, who else is in any network? And there's real clear rules of engagement. This is what joining into a network, what membership looks like. And there is a level of resourcefulness and service to the task to keep your partner members, to develop relationships with your partner members and in service to purpose. And on the whole in networks, you just try things out iteratively. You test, you try, you weave and duck and weave until you find the thing that works. Whereas in hierarchies, in the performance management world, there isn't this iteration. There are absolute rewards and punishment. You've either done it right or you haven't done it right. And it has its reward if you have and its punishment if it doesn't. So it's a much more expertise-based model in hierarchies. And so if you're thinking about it in terms of language, you might say hierarchies are more about management and networks are more about leadership. Hierarchies are more about day-to-day, networks are much more about being agile. Hierarchies are really around accredited QA programs. Networks tend to be much more about bespoke, personalized. If you're thinking about the nature of what people focus on, their time and energy on networks, people focus their time and energy on information and learning. In hierarchies, people focus their time and energy on governance and risk management. So you can see how hierarchies tend to be inward-facing, networks tend to be outward-facing. They get their energy from externally, and networks tend to have what we often call a volunteer army, i.e., if you're really committed to the purpose and you have a good relationship with other network members, you tend to just give all. And people will volunteer time, energy, capacity to do new work and new things together. Whereas in hierarchies, people tend to do the thing, and the additional added value is harder to achieve. So, and the default mode in hierarchy is what we know how to do, and the default mode in networks is change it, basically. So you can see it's a much more dynamic. Now, this is already sounding a little bit judgmental and a little bit value-laden, and it's not meant to. It's just to say that you absolutely have to have both, and you have to be in service to both, but you can't use one model for the other. They're not interchangeable. So what is network work? Network work is the wicked, not the tame. I've got a picture of a family here and a picture of an operating theatre. An operating theatre is tame. It is predictable. If it wasn't predictable, none of us would go under the knife. But in a wicked world, which is a good example of families, your own family's experience comes there here, which is it isn't predictable, it is entirely relational. As you have children, as your children grow up and change over time, so you change over time, as your parents change over time, you change over time. Your role, your the nature of your place in a family changes at any one time. And that's pretty much how networks are too. So you take complex issues, i.e. where if you fix one thing, something else pops up. That's usually how we talk about complex problems. It's a waterbed world. I think I've sorted this bit out, and it generates another issue or a knock-on effect or an unknown, unanticipated side effect. That's a world of complexity. That's where you have to be very adaptive. The tame world is absolutely predictable. There are no side effects in the tame world. It's where a lot of the patient safety work needs to focus. So we're looking at that world of complexity and adaptability when we're looking at networks. Okay. So what's known about networks? Well, I think that the key feature of any network is we're in it together for something, and you're very explicit about what that's for. And that the for something could be something that you're advocating for. It could be a lobby group. It could be a learning community. We don't think we can do this without learning more together. It could be a delivery group. You might say that we need a network. That's what the Vanguard's all about. They're really accountable care systems all about trying to set up networks that can co-deliver, really share risk together, share finance together, move resources around the partners. Quite a challenge. So there's a number of types of networks. I talked about advocacy, I talked about learning, I talked about delivery. Those are the most common ones. But they're very clear what they're in it for, and that's easily explained by any member of the network. And it's not held at the top, it's held in a collaborative model. It's developed collaboratively. So what you find in networks is that they have a different need around information, governance, design, learning, leadership. It's a much, much more dynamic model. Networks at the outset need leaders that are very committed to purpose, very galvanizing, usually highly energetic, and very clear about impact. And then over time, you need leaders who are nurturing, because as members become more able and generating ideas themselves, the network leader's job is to be in service to that. So the network leaders are much more of a facilitator, still demonstrating impact, still sharing across the members the impact of the network as a whole, still temperature testing with members, still nurturing individual members' participation, but it's a facilitative role. So network leadership changes over time, quite different from hierarchies. And what you find in networks is that there is the resource you use for common good, but it isn't done in a punitive way. You don't count things. You don't say, well, I gave 3 beans today, so I'm owed 3 beans next week. On the whole, members are happy when they're getting the impact that they came into the network for in relation to purpose. So as long as the network is making impact, sometimes people will give more, sometimes they will take more. As long as people are actively participating. So what you will find in a network, it will spit people out or organisations out who purely take and don't give. But the giving can be very generous in terms of its range. So the giving can be a bit of space, or it can be listening, or it can be generating information. It can be all sorts of things. But being active in the network is the point at which you can both take and give. So this reciprocity isn't done in a transactional way about who gives more gets more. It's done in service to the task, not in terms of what I owe. And the other thing about networks is this nature of ebbs and flows. So because people realize purpose differently over time, you might find that your purpose is really, really important right now. There's masses of energy. And then maybe you've done a really good thing, and you're in a network around Parkinson's disease, and you've managed to get the drug companies to drop their prices. You've got all the research going, and it's being discussed in the House of Parliament. It's on the news every day. And therefore you think, well, actually we've done a lot here. And so people can sit back a little, and it might ebb back, and they feel they've achieved something. And then something else happens to somebody in the network, or there's something new that people want to learn, or they find that actually it's gone off the agenda, and it might liven the network up again. So it's quite common for networks to ebb and flow and to thrive and die. And so that sometimes that might be with let's say you had a network around lobbying around Parkinson's disease. You might say, actually, we've done that, it's achieved everything it wanted to, and then there's no point having the network. So unlike hierarchies, which tend to be here to stay, networks can ebb and flow over time, and it's not a indicator of failure if a network dies or ceases to exist. It's often an indicator of success, and that's quite different from within hierarchies. So there are some features of networks that are really important. One is that they're very dynamic around meeting diverse members' needs. So if you are a member of a network, you have to get something out of it. And whilst you might be in a shared purpose, your needs might be different. So you might have a collaborative learning network where some folks are more at base camp and some folks are further ahead, or some folks are really interested in learning from international colleagues, some folks from local folk. Some folks have amazing learning platforms, some folks don't have anything. And so that the diversity of those networks is really important if you're going to together develop something that's useful for a wider community. So often in meeting your own needs, you also meet a much wider community's needs, particularly in a learning network. I talked about them being time limited. I talked about them being knowledge seeking. So on the whole, networks are hungry for change. I think that's the best way of describing it. And so in service to being hungry for change, they also desperately trying to find out more. Now, you can find out more from other members. Quite often, the co-inquiry is a really important part of any network. The intelligence is very rarely out there. Intelligence is nearly always in here. But finding partners in networks who you can inquire with, learn from, learn with is really important. So they're good sharing places and they're good innovation places. And you can, as a network, prototype on behalf of each other. By prototype, I mean test something new out on behalf of and with other members, but you do that in a very rapid cycle. So that you put it in practice, you evaluate it, and you see whether it works or not. And you do it as a, you might call quick and dirty. I just think fast is a better way of putting it. And so you might try something out, and that you might be trying out, for instance, telephone service for GPs on arrhythmias. And in the network, and let's say this network is a place, and you found that your GPs aren't diagnosing arrhythmias particularly fantastically, you could try that out quickly on the network. You might, as a network yourself, be networked with other systems that are trying to do work on arrhythmia. You might go find out and learn how they've done it. They might supervise you in your testing out of this new way of doing something. You might share your learning from that. You'll certainly share your learning locally. So what you should find in networks is the capacity to try things out quickly. That's a pretty good symbol, pretty good test that you're in a network. So functions networks, what are they useful for, really? So they're good at this nature of community building. So if you're joining a network because you have a set of values and a clear purpose, then on your own, sometimes you can be a bit under attack. So let's say you're in a co-production network, co-production learning community. I've been in one of those. So I was really very passionate about the benefit of co-production to health and social care as a whole. When I first joined a network around that, not many other people did. What you thought it was, thought it was just patient engagement on that sort of ladder. And so I wanted to be in a community of other folks that were willing to explore a deeper understanding of co-production, particularly around the elements of co-delivering. Most people do co-design and some people do co-problem solving, but very, very few organisations and services can do co-delivery. They really struggle with that. So in order to sustain the values of co-production, as I understood it, me and my team, we were looking for others that want to do the same, and that's quite common in a network. It sort of helps you sustain your own value set and explore from there. Oops, sorry, I pressed the wrong button there. So one thing a network can do for you, so back to, let's say, I was involved in a co-production network. What the network itself could do was try and generate and filter the amount of data and intelligence in the wider world around co-production and then share it with network members. It's quite good at the filtering. You've got a good capacity in networks filtering, that's really important. Next thing is it can amplify it. So if this, in the early days of co-production, there weren't many of us involved in it, and shouting out from a corner of Leeds that I was at the time about co-production, its value, what it really was, what it really wasn't, was a sort of lone voice. So if you join a network, you're now in a voice of allies, you're in a collective, so you've got a much bigger voice. So on the whole, networks are good at amplifying, or scaling. You might say scaling up, but I think amplifying is a better word. giving more weight to any views, arguments, theories you have. I think that any network must always enable every member to do things better. If you aren't doing things better as well, the network's not working for you. And then I think sometimes that members can help each other out when they're stuck on stuff, and the resources can be, it can be actual money, or it can be information, or it can be people. But on the whole, networks could do any of these things. And the final thing is that networks can host, they can convene, they can bring different sorts of people together, because they're not stuck in the hierarchical line management of having to ask permission. They can bring all sorts of folks together in service to the purpose of the network. So that's what networks do, that's the function of them. And then a little bit just about the distinctiveness of them. So I've covered some of these before, but one is the nature of innovation and sharing that. I think what's distinctive is that notion of peer-based. And I think if you go into a network thinking I'm the network manager, and therefore I'm going to write the strategy and describe to members what they're going to get out of it, you've lost it. So power and leadership is distributed in any network, and members of networks can take leadership roles at any one time. So it might be that as a member at the moment, I have some capacity, or I am particularly interested in something the network's doing right now, I step up to the mark and say, look, I'll lead this part. So you don't have a structure in a network of people who lead bits of it. People volunteer in to take leadership roles around issues that are of particular interest in relation to that network's purpose. Okay. This reciprocity exchange is a really defining relationship. So the mutuality of the relationships is absolutely key. It's very common for network membership to fluctuate. So one of the things that I think network leaders struggle with is that people come and go in networks, and often folks think it's a sign of failure. I know when we were having our co-production network evaluated, one of the evaluators said it's a disaster because there's such a high turnover. And I said, I think that's a real success. It means lots of people are still coming. So the folks that are going have learned, have got what they want out of it. They might have changed jobs, and they might have taken it somewhere else, or it might just not be for them right now. But it wasn't dying, you know, it wasn't then not being replaced. There were new folks coming on who were intrigued and wanting to do things. So it's pretty common in networks that you have this real fluctuation, turnover of people, but you also have the fluctuation in how members engage with the network. So people can sleep for a bit and then come back engaged. What you need to watch as a network leader is over time that all your members are active. So if you take a period of a year that you've got all your members are taking leadership or actively contributing, or you can see their energy somewhere in the network. So as a network leader, your role is both temperature testing and nurturing, just keeping an eye on these dynamics and making sure that you haven't got sleeping partners who then become slumbering and sleeping partners for a long time. And that just pisses everybody else in the network off, and you begin to start fragmenting your network. So networks that work well adapt, thrive, and survive. And they do that by persistently reviewing purpose, impact against purpose. So that network meetings are as much, not just about learning and sharing. Is the purpose that we have fit for purpose still? Are we all getting something out of it? Is it making the difference that we want it to do? And because you're using this voluntary capacity, it's very quick to adapt, because it'll either give up if it's not doing what members think it should do, or it will adapt to change to any new environments or to any new members' requirements, etc. So on the whole, a network leader's job is to make sure there's plenty of time for network members to review purpose and to review impact together. And then I guess one of the final issues is that networks are only as good as the knowledge held in the network. And a knowledge function is really critical. Again, it's probably one of the things that's most neglected, particularly by network leaders, about how do you generate a knowledge sharing function in any network. No matter whether it's an ACO, a Vanguard, or it's a professional network looking at arrhythmias, you absolutely have to have a level of shared knowledge. So key features, we've talked about shared purpose, We've talked about issues that it has to be compelling for network members. It has to really, they really have to feel they want to do it. It must meet those members' needs. The leadership needs to adapt over time. It has to be strong relationships. That means you can fall. Relationships doesn't mean just being nice and getting on. It means you can fall out with each other. But primarily, those relationships, what I call mature, effective relationships, they'd be like you have in your home relationships. So you can fall out, you can argue, but you can still love each other. And that's pretty much the tenure of relationships in networks. And networks absolutely must generate some output. They must do something, or else people, the purpose becomes impossible to serve, and people fall out with it, and the network dies. So you need to know what your impact is. And again, for a network leader, it's pretty critical that you have in place mechanisms to know whether your network is working and whether it's having any impact or not. So network leadership is facilitative, it's distributed, it's shared, it's very democratic and inclusive. It isn't about any one person having a louder voice than anybody else. You earn rewards by the amount that you put into a network, but it doesn't give you more say. It's quite an interesting model. And you have to be able to make the most difference in the network. So if there's a difference in the network, you don't see those as a problem, you see those as a solution. The diversity is where you get to the new innovations. It's not something that you have to manage out. You actively have to manage it in. You have to try and create an understanding of where are we different over what, why is that, what does that tell us, and what can we do differently together. So it's pretty important, diversity as a topic, as a process within a network. It's pretty clear. So as a network leader, you've got to be really comfortable with conflict in service to task. You've got to be comfortable with challenge. You've got to be comfortable with approaches to knowledge sharing and dissemination knowledge. You've got to be really comfortable with evaluation and impact. You've got to be very facilitative. You've got to be in service to members' needs. So you're absolutely the bottom of the hierarchy, not the top of it, if you were thinking in that term in any way, in any sort of structural way for networks. So as a sort of hub and spoke model, you're always looking about how can we best ensure that this network is reaching its clear purpose in a way that all members can participate. And I think that's quite a shift in function. So your attention is always on who's playing, who's not playing, why not. And if as a network leader you're finding any members of the network are sort of quietening down, taking it very into that sleeping mode, it's a really good time to go see them and say, come on, why is that? Is that just because your energy is a bit low? Is it just not quite the right time? Is it the network's reached a place you're quite happy with it? Is it because you're not happy with it? Is it because you don't know what you can give? You know, so you're really in a sort of, some folks say quite a mothering role to, but certainly a nurturing role to your network members. And it's pretty clear that that's what network leadership involves. So, and finally, as we run up to the half-past moment, then top tips for running networks. So what is brokerage? This is trying to enable members to work together. Sometimes you find that in diversity, whilst you as a network leader might be very familiar and capable with conflict, your network members might not be, and they might find that quite challenging, and they might find it quite judgmental, particularly if they're primarily in a hierarchical performance management model in their day lives. So brokering relationships, brokering partnerships is pretty critical in terms of where you run your network. So try and get together with that. The next one is spanning boundaries. You know, trying to make sure that you can enable people to work together who wouldn't traditionally do so. Make sure you focus on that knowledge function. Keep that dialogue constant in any network, and if things are going a bit quiet, engineer something that enables people to be talking together. Posing questions is always very powerful as any leader. The peer relationships I talked about. I think you have to model that transparency, commitment, and mutual respect. Networks are open. There is no way out of it. You can't hide things in networks because it's a membership democratic model. So you do have to model that in the way you work and the way papers are generated, etc. You need to be pretty good with negotiating, and here's the top tips. So make sure that as if you're running a network, check out what other networks there are that do something similar to you. You'll find that we're all networks within networks, and so there may be some really amazing stuff out there that you can tap into, or some good experience, or you could collaborate with another network. You do need design of the network. It does have to have these simple rules. It has to have some rules about what membership is. It has to have some rules about what joining up and joining in looks like. It has to have some rules about what disengagement looks like, so that you can say to folks, you know what, you're not playing, we can't have you as a member of the network from here on. So it does need some boundary rules, and you have got to set those, and that's quite, it has to be negotiated with the network as a whole, but setting some simple rules around behaviours, what reciprocity looks like in this network is pretty important. Be energetic. So the thing about networks is they should be places that energize. So focusing on action, what we're doing together. There's usually matters going on, noticing the ebb and flow, and just finding where there's energy, where there are people who are committed. Recognise there may be some, that might be some of the unusual suspects over time. So keeping a good eye on your whole network. Make sure you learn from this difference, bringing those different communities and types of knowledge together, and finally, keep a focus on impact. Finally, keep a focus on impact. So top tips for me is make the most of the resources out there, keep energy high, be clear what the rules are, because otherwise you're going to find that you're never in service to purpose. Talk a lot and often, and make sure you're making a difference. And that's our time up. I hope you enjoyed it.